Hefty tax write-offs, creepy cartoon characters, and studios turning their backs on visionary directors. These are just a few of the moronic reasons some films got cancelled. It's hard to pin the cancellation of a movie on one specific mistake, as a variety of factors usually play a role. That appears to be what happened with The Amazing Spider-Man 3. Andrew Garfield first donned the red and blue suit in 2012's The Amazing Spider-Man. That movie successfully kicked off a rebooted Spider-Man franchise, but trouble was just around the corner. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 fell flat with critics and didn't make as much money as its predecessor at the box office.
Whatever, I don't know, I tried to think about it.
How's that working out for you?
Perfectly.
Sony clearly had worries coming out of the sequel, but then Garfield put the nail in the series' coffin. In 2014, Sony hosted a massive event in Rio de Janeiro, and Garfield was supposed to show up to help the studio officially announce the release date for The Amazing Spider-Man 3. At the last minute, he decided not to attend. A year later, when Sony's servers were hacked, fans learned that Garfield's decision not to show up led to his firing. Sony took Spider-Man in a different direction, and fans didn't see Garfield as Spidey again until the multiversal madness of Marvel's Spider-Man No Way Home. It takes some seriously misguided ingenuity to profit off a movie without releasing it, but Warner Brothers somehow pulled it off with Batgirl. The studio made Batgirl as part of the DCEU and gave the film everything it needed to succeed. A $90 million budget, plus stars like J.K. Simmons, Brendan Fraser, and Leslie Grace playing the lead.
Hi DC fandom, and I renew Batgirl.
The movie was just about ready to go when Warner Brothers pulled the plug. There were conflicting opinions on why the movie got canceled. DC Studios CEO Peter Safran told Deadline, "There are a lot of incredibly talented people in front of and behind the camera in that film, but that was not releasable. It happens sometimes."
But this didn't even really get a fair shake.
Others noted that by refusing to make any money from the movie, Warner Brothers would be able to use the budget as a hefty tax write-off. Whatever the reason, not believing in Batgirl was definitely a mistake. The Disney era of Star Wars has brought an explosion of content for fans to dive into. Back when Rogue One and Solo: A Star Wars Story were still in development, Disney also had plans for a movie centered on another fan-favorite character, Boba Fett. Josh Trank was recruited to direct the film, but mistakes he made on the set of another film killed the project before it ever really began. Trank broke out with 2012's Chronicle, a creative approach to the superhero genre that landed him a job directing the 2015 Fantastic Four reboot. While working on that movie, Trank was staying in a rental house, and his dogs reportedly caused around $100,000 worth of damage to the property. That, combined with rumors that Trank was difficult to work with, raised big red flags for Disney, and the studio pivoted away from its plans for a Boba Fett movie. For better or worse, fans of the most famous bounty hunter in the galaxy got the Book of Boba Fett series on Disney Plus instead. Spider-Man 4 is one of those tantalizing what-if stories. The movie would have continued from where Spider-Man 3 left off, introducing some classic comic book characters like the Vulture along the way. Unfortunately, Sony refused to give Sam Raimi the time he needed to make the movie great. The studio wanted Spider-Man 4 to be released in May 2011, but the process of writing the script dragged on longer than expected. After numerous rewrites, Raimi still wasn't happy with what he had, and he told the studio that the release date would need to be moved. Sony pushed back on that, and eventually Raimi left the project altogether, leaving Sony to reboot the franchise. Ironically, the first movie in the relaunched series, The Amazing Spider-Man, didn't debut until July 2012, so Sony missed its deadline anyway. Like any other franchise, the Alien series has had its fair shares of ups and downs. Ridley Scott kicked the series off with the original 1979 film, but the franchise arguably peaked in the 80s when James Cameron stepped in to direct the sequel, Aliens. More sequels and spin-offs kept popping up for years, but in 2012, Scott was back in the director's chair, intending to create a prequel trilogy. Alien Awakening would have marked the end of Scott's prequel story, but apparently it was never meant to be. Ultimately, there may have been a problem with making the prequel into a trilogy in the first place. Audiences were a bit frustrated with Prometheus, the first prequel film, because it raised so many questions about the Alien universe without coming close to answering any of them.
Hey, baby.
You're strong.
The next film, Alien Covenant, still didn't provide any satisfying answers and suffered a lackluster performance at the box office. It didn't help matters that Scott made some confusing remarks about the trajectory of the franchise. In some interviews, he insisted that 6 more movies could follow Covenant. Audiences didn't get excited for the stretched-out, confusing prequel series, so Awakening didn't see the light of day. There are enough characters in the X-Men comics to support dozens of standalone films, and for a moment it seemed like that's what we were going to get. 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine seemed ready to kick off a slew of spin-offs, but that movie's spectacular failure isn't what finally killed another X-Men standalone. Gambit is a beloved X-Men character who grew up in New Orleans and developed the ability to charge objects with explosive energy. Taylor Kitsch briefly brought the character to life in X-Men Origins, but that film's poor reception delayed Gambit's solo outing. Eventually, Channing Tatum got involved in the project, so Gambit started to seem like a real possibility. Then Fox made a fatal error. After the 2015 Fantastic Four reboot flopped, the studio slimmed down the budget on Gambit. The change delayed production just long enough for Disney to swoop in and buy Fox, effectively erasing the original X-Men movie continuity, and with it, Gambit. The Divergent series came at the tail end of the young adult book-to-movie trend. It followed successful series like Harry Potter and The Hunger Games, but it might have taken the wrong lesson from those movies. The Harry Potter adaptation split the final book into 2 movies, and pretty soon everyone else was following suit. For Divergent, however, following the trend completely backfired. It didn't necessarily make sense story-wise for the last Divergent novel to be split into 2 movies, but Lionsgate went ahead with it anyway. When the 3rd movie, Allegiant, flopped, the studio tried to change its plans at the last minute. Lionsgate cut the budget for the 4th film, Ascendant, deciding to release it as a TV movie. The stars pushed back, and eventually Ascendant went nowhere at all. Haven't there been a zillion Dune adaptations? Asks the uninitiated. There have been 3, to be precise. But longtime Dune fans know that the wildest version of Frank Herbert's universe never became a reality. In the 1970s, famed director Alejandro Jodorowsky had a bizarre vision for Dune, and today his adaptation is considered one of the greatest films never made. Jodorowsky made many mistakes while trying to adapt Dune, the first of which was not actually reading the novel that Herbert wrote. But his biggest mistake, and the one that killed the project, was refusing to put any restrictions on his extremely ambitious ideas. Jodorowsky planned a Dune film that would alter the minds of all its viewers and be hailed as a spiritual experience that changed film history and world history forever.
I want to create a prophet to change the young mind of all the world.
To achieve his dream movie, Jodorowsky had a few entirely unreasonable requirements. He wanted $15 million to create expansive sets, develop an earth-shattering soundtrack, and make Salvador Dali do 1 hour of work as the highest-paid actor in history. He also demanded that the movie be allowed to stretch to the 10 or 12-hour mark. Plenty of work on the movie got done, but in the end, Jodorowsky couldn't find enough money to see the project to completion. If the Hobbit trilogy left a bad taste in your mouth, it might be better to pretend that a previously canceled version never existed in the first place. There was a not-so-brief moment in the mid-2000s where it looked like J.R.R. Tolkien's beloved novel would get an adaptation produced by Peter Jackson and directed by Guillermo del Toro. The project was announced several years after the conclusion of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and del Toro signed on right away. The first hiccup in the project had to do with the rights to the story. MGM owned The Hobbit, but New Line Cinema had produced the Lord of the Rings movies. After that issue was settled, it looked like del Toro's The Hobbit would be able to hit theaters in the 2010s. But the path forward wasn't so easy. New Line Cinema was struggling financially, so it held off on putting The Hobbit into full production. Eventually, del Toro got sick of waiting and moved on to do other things. It may have just been a case of bad timing, but if New Line had acted faster on the project, we all would have seen del Toro's vision of Middle-earth for ourselves. After the massive success of Gladiator in 2000, director Ridley Scott and star Russell Crowe were both interested in a sequel.
Are you not entertained?
The two of them needed someone who could write a screenplay that could somehow work around the fact that Crowe's character had died. So they turned to Nick Cave, frontman of the Bad Seeds. Writing Gladiator 2 would have been a monumental task for anyone, but Cave didn't really have any experience as a screenwriter at the time. He told Collider that after sending his finished screenplay to Crowe, the Oscar winner told him flatly that he didn't like it. Luckily, Cave enjoyed working on the script anyway. In 2024, a new version of Gladiator 2 was brought to life, this time without Crowe. Screenwriter David Scarpa was ultimately left with the challenge of coming up with a good way to follow up the original. The original Barbarella comic was written by Jean-Claude Forest and published in the 1960s. A film adaptation starring Jane Fonda came along in 1968 and was a critical success.
A good many dramatic situations begin with screaming.
The film wasn't enough of a hit to spawn a whole Barbarella movie franchise, but it was always going to be a matter of time before someone attempted a remake. We almost got to see a version of the character brought to life by Robert Rodriguez. Hot on the heels of Rodriguez's success adapting Sin City into a feature film, he was offered a chance to repeat his success with forced source material. But Rodriguez turned down a $70 million budget for Barbarella because of a poor decision made by the producers. A German company was financing most of the film, but as a condition for getting the money, the entire movie had to be shot in Germany. Rodriguez, a father of 5, balked at the idea of being away from his family for months on end. He declined the project, and the Barbarella reboot died shortly thereafter. Anyone who tuned into Comedy Central at any point in the 2010s is at least a bit familiar with Workaholics. The series starred creators Blake Anderson, Adam Devine, and Anders Holm as a trio of friends who spend their days working in telemarketing and their nights pursuing various schemes in their shared home. The show ran for 7 seasons between 2011 and 2017, but fans were always hungry for more. In 2021, it looked like fans were going to get what they wanted. Comedy Central announced plans for a Workaholics movie that would stream on Paramount Plus sometime in the near future. The movie would focus on the gang getting up to their usual shenanigans, but this time through the lens of work and life during the pandemic. Then, just as work on the film was about to really get underway, the streamer pulled the plug. Paramount Plus stated that the movie didn't fit into its content strategy moving forward. But at the same time, the platform refused to relinquish the rights to Workaholics. Speaking with Cinema Blend, Devine explained that he thought Paramount Plus was worried about the possibility of selling off the movie, only for it to become a huge success on another platform. He said, no one wants to look like bozos.
So essentially, we were like kind of in the gray area of, were they going to get the bang for their buck?
As long as the platform is sitting on the fence, the Workaholics movie is dead in the water. Stephen King first published his post-apocalyptic epic The Stand in 1978. Like so many of his other stories, The Stand was instantly begging for some kind of adaptation. For a brief moment, it looked like another horror master would help bring King's story to a new audience. Night of the Living Dead director George A. Romero told Sci-Fi Now that working on The Stand was one of his biggest frustrations as a director. According to Romero, he and King butted heads because the author refused to let The Stand be adapted as a TV series and instead thought it should be a 3-hour movie. Romero recalled, "At that time, Steve was very insistent about getting his own way, and if he couldn't get his way, he would just pull the plug and say forget about it." The two never found funding for their movie, but years later, The Stand was adapted into not one, but 2 different TV miniseries. Arnold Schwarzenegger was already one of the biggest action stars around when he partnered with director Paul Verhoeven to create the sci-fi classic Total Recall in 1990. The two planned to reunite for another blockbuster called Crusade, which would have been set in the Middle Ages. The film would have followed Schwarzenegger's character as he transformed from a lowly thief to a holy crusader who eventually turns on Christianity. Crusade had everything it needed to succeed, including a script by Waylon Green, the screenwriter behind The Wild Bunch. Then Verhoeven killed the project in one fell swoop. When Schwarzenegger and Verhoeven met with executives to try and secure funding for the movie, the potential backers wanted Verhoeven to guarantee that the project wouldn't go over its $100 million budget. Apparently, the mere suggestion that Verhoeven could guarantee anything enraged the director. He went off on a tirade about the unexpected complications that arise in filmmaking and the unpredictability of life itself. It was too much for the potential producers. They backed out of the movie and now Crusade is just a Hollywood legend. Midnight Rider was supposed to star the late William Hurt as classic rock legend Greg Allman. Filming began in February 2014 with a sequence of a train going over a trestle in rural Wayne County, Georgia. A hospital bed was placed on the trestle. It wasn't the safest shooting location, so much so that the company that owned the railway denied filming permission to the production.
He had been told don't go on those tracks, and he did anyway.
While they were filming, a train came down the tracks, and seeing as they were high over a river, not everyone was able to get off the trestle in time. As the train hit the bed, flying debris knocked camera assistant Sarah Jones into its path, where she was killed instantly. The movie's director, Randall Miller, was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and criminal trespassing. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and 8 years of probation. No other scenes for Midnight Rider were ever shot. When Beatlemania rocked the world, the band pursued all kinds of projects that seemed kind of strange in hindsight. One such side hustle was the 1968 movie Yellow Submarine. The film is full of stunning cartoon work and plenty of musical numbers, and it's really a one-of-a-kind movie that could never be recreated.
I liked the way they varied the animation styles.
But that hasn't stopped some people from trying. At the 2009 D23 Expo, Disney announced that it would remake Yellow Submarine, with the help of director Robert Zemeckis and his Image Movers studio. The idea of remaking the movie was arguably a mistake in the first place, especially considering how expensive the rights to the Beatles' music were going to be. But that's not where it ended. The rebooted Yellow Submarine would have gone for a darker tone, playing up the Blue Meanies and Pepperland to be more gritty and scary than they were in the 60s. Image Movers would also have used motion capture technology to make the film's animation a bit more realistic, thus amplifying the darker tone even more. None of that sounds like anything Beatle fans would want. Luckily, Disney realized its mistake before the movie got too far along, and we were all saved from seeing a nightmarish animated Beatles movie. Stanley Kubrick has said that he came up with the idea for Napoleon during the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Kubrick wrote a 148-page screenplay and took intricate notes on Napoleon's life and the minute historical details of his time. But all that work wasn't enough. When Kubrick took his ideas to MGM, the studio that had financed 2001, he got turned down. The studio didn't believe that Kubrick's historical drama would find an audience, but it couldn't have been more wrong. Despite only being in the earliest stages of production, Kubrick's Napoleon is a regular competitor for the title of Best Movie Never Made. Napoleon has plagued the imaginations of film buffs for decades, but it might be coming a little closer to reality in the near future. Steven Spielberg announced plans to adapt Kubrick's massive screenplay into a 7-part series for HBO, although it's not clear whether that project has been supplanted by Ridley Scott's big screen 2023 epic Napoleon.
I'm the first to admit when I make a mistake.
In 1984, sci-fi author William Gibson helped popularize the cyberpunk genre with Neuromancer. The novel is set in a high-tech, low-life future and tells a fairly straightforward heist story, albeit one filled with computer hackers and artificial intelligences. Neuromancer has always been ripe for adaptation, but somehow a movie has never managed to coalesce. Fans were closest to seeing Neuromancer on the big screen in the early 2010s. Vincenzo Natali signed on to direct the film with Gibson's blessing. 3 years later, though, the movie still wasn't in production. Natali told Crave Online, "The script has been ready for years. That's not the holdup. The challenging part of this is putting the money together." Even with a celebrated sci-fi director and a finished script, the movie languished for years. No one prioritized adapting one of the most popular sci-fi novels of all time. And by the time some new financiers got on board in 2015, they had to start the search for a script and director all over again, because Natali had left the project behind. Ronnie Rocket is the original movie that David Lynch never got to make. The visionary director had an idea for a film about electricity, detectives, and 3-foot-tall rock stars. Ronnie Rocket sounds as wonderfully bizarre and imaginative as anything else that Lynch has created, and its absence is due to 2 different errors. The first happened a long time ago. Lynch had just come up with the idea for a new, deeply strange movie. He was already known for making 1977's Eraserhead, but without the benefit of a lengthy career to back him up, he had a hard time selling his new idea to studios. He decided to put the project on the back burner and let life go on. Ronnie Rocket might have had another shot at getting made, if not for Lynch himself. In a 2013 interview with Bomb, Lynch talked about why Ronnie Rocket couldn't work anymore, even though he now had the resources to get the movie made. He pinned the blame on an odd culprit. Graffiti kills the possibility to go back in time and have the buildings be as they were. Because of graffiti, Lynch believed that he couldn't recreate the industrial smokestack aesthetic he needed for the film to work. In the late 1960s, Columbia Pictures planned to make a film about Malcolm X after acquiring the rights to the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley. The studio hired James Baldwin to write the screenplay and moved him out to Los Angeles to start working on the project. When you've got one of the greatest writers in American history working on a film about one of the most influential civil rights leaders of all time, you should probably stay out of his way. Naturally, the studio didn't. Baldwin's vision for the film wasn't the sanitized story that executives wanted. Even worse than that disagreement, though, was that someone suggested that Charlton Heston play Malcolm in blackface. In the end, Baldwin finished his script, which was sold to Warner Brothers and never shown to the public. Decades later, when Spike Lee set his sights on telling Malcolm's story, he tracked down Baldwin's script and used it as inspiration. So, even though Baldwin's movie got canceled, part of it lives on in 1992's Malcolm X.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us.
There's one film on this list that would have been undeniably worth watching, and that's the Sex Pistols movie written by Roger Ebert. That may sound like the description of a fever dream, but the movie very nearly got made. And it was called Who Killed Bambi? Well, eventually that was the title. When Ebert first wrote the screenplay in 1977, it was called Anarchy in the UK. Ebert himself suggested the title change, which director Russ Meyer and producer Malcolm McLaren quickly greenlit. The punk rock movie probably wouldn't have become a cinematic masterpiece, but as an artifact of rock history, it would have been priceless. There are multiple reasons why Who Killed Bambi never got made, not the least of which is that making a feature film isn't very punk rock. The Sex Pistols were always anti-establishment, but that's a hard stance to maintain in the movie business. The mistake that ultimately doomed the film, however, belongs to McLaren. He planned to get the film released a year after the screenplay was written, which was overly ambitious, and along the way, he forgot to secure funding for the movie. McLaren didn't pay some of the crew, so they walked out, killing the movie just a few days after it started shooting. Disney stopped work on the Aristocats 2 before it ever had a hope of coming out. But the would-be animated feature still had an influence on other Disney animation projects. According to animator Todd Carter, the Aristocats 2 was surprisingly far in development when it got cancelled. The film had already gone through multiple scripts by the time the animators got to work. The producers wanted to start getting work done, so Carter and the other artists came up with a solution. By adjusting their usual process, they were able to finish a rough story reel for the film in just 5 weeks. But that wasn't enough to save the movie. At the time, Disney was shifting its strategy away from making sequels, so the studio pulled the plug on the movie at the last minute. But all the work on the story reel had unintended consequences. Carter joked to Animated News, "The bad news was that we had established a precedent of what can be accomplished in that time frame, and the producers and budgeters at Disney had taken notice."